Hello, Brian Craddock again. This is my worship reflection for Hispanic Catholic Mass. I attended St. Michael's Church, St. Michael's Catholic Church here in Memphis last Saturday, and I went to the Hispanic service. They do an English service, and they have a Hispanic service. The Hispanic service was at night, so I went at 6. And as far as media goes, actually for this video, there will be only this one picture right here. They did not allow anyone to have their cell phones out to have any pictures or any video or anything like that. So the media is fairly limited in this particular one, and it was not overwhelming in the previous ones. I just felt a little disrespectful. Kind of filming with my cell phone. That being said, however, I did have a very interesting time at Catholic Mass. I've never been to a Catholic Mass before. The closest that I'd ever come was an Anglican church, and I guess for this class, but also I had been to an Anglican service before and an Anglican wedding, so I was familiar with that, and it was sort of my only exposure to that type of a service, that High Holy Church service, which I think is really beautiful, and there are aspects of it that are really appealing because of that beauty. So the pastor who spoke when I was there at St. Michael's, his name is written down so I don't forget. It's very long. It is Reverend Jose Cruz Zapata Torres. I'm sure that I butchered that. But he was a fairly short and kind of plump man who was really just so kind. You could just tell in his eyes, and obviously there was no English being spoken. There was Latin and there was Spanish, and that was it. This was definitely the most out of place that I felt in any of these services. I've been to all kinds of services in all kinds of denominations of churches. I've led worship in all kinds of denominations of churches, at least those that more closely match sort of my own faith tradition. But this was the first time that I really felt like I was sort of the odd man out. Not only was I ethnically the odd man out, I was kind of the only white person in the whole room. It was a room full of Hispanic speaking people, be they Mexican or Spanish, or American, wherever they were from. They all were Spanish speaking people who were not as white as I am. And so that always just sort of makes you feel a little bit defensive, isn't quite the right word, but a little bit strange. You sort of feel like the odd man out because you are. You sort of stick out like a sore thumb, and everyone knows you're there, and everyone's looking at you. And on top of that, I also did not speak the same language. And while some of the parishioners spoke English and were able to, welcome me, it was definitely an interesting situation that I've only ever felt really when I went to Africa with my wife before we got married. We went to Ethiopia for a medical mission trip, and we were in Africa, so I was the whitest person they'd ever seen, much less had been in the room. And I also did not speak the same language. And for one of the days, I could barely understand my interpreter, so just because his accent was so thick. So this is the first time I've really felt like that since then. And as for the service itself, it was really well structured, like any mass would be, I would assume. Just because of research and because of just reading in Christian music, the Global History book that is our textbook, and also just my grandmother was Catholic, and I sort of have a general understanding of Catholic Mass. I understand that it's very structured. The liturgy is staunch. It is deep. Sorry about that. My dog knocked something over. Anyway, I know that the liturgy is heavy. It is very controlled. There's not a lot of freedom within that liturgy to feel like the prod of the Holy Spirit or anything like that. Not that the Holy Spirit isn't working in those very structured lines, but um, those lines are there very clearly there. And sometimes it's actually difficult to hear. It took me several sentences when they would switch from from Spanish to Latin, and then from Latin to Spanish, just because they're both Latin is obviously Latin based, but Spanish is Latin based, so it was really difficult to know. Oh, they're speaking like everyone understands these words, and then no one understands these words. As far as instrumentation goes, there really wasn't any. This particular service was just through chant, through song of the priest. There was some singing on the part of the congregation. It was very kind of call and response in some places, and you would read off of your bulletin if you could read the language the bulletin was in, which I could not. And so they had their own readings, which were in the Catholic Church are sort of chosen for you by your bishop. I mean, there's really just the church calendar that you go through, and you always read these sections. You always speak out of these sections. You always do this particular mass on this particular Sunday, or Saturday, or whatever day. And they're very nailed down. You know what you're going to be doing for the next year, if you're the priest. And so the liturgies are very, very evident, and the readings are pre-selected, but they're, I'm sure, great. It was difficult to really kind of get into the service since I was such an odd man out in the service, and I was there by myself too. I didn't have any. Hannah couldn't come with me, and obviously this was bedtime for the kids. It was 6 o'clock. I left at dinner time, and when I came back, the kids were sleeping. So as far as commonalities go between this Catholic Mass and the Protestant faith, which I was brought up in, that faith tradition, the liturgy itself is actually a commonality, and it wasn't quite as staunch and it wasn't quite as rigid, but that structure is very important and was very important, especially in the very conservative church that I was in. And it was the same every week, and the readings were always in the same place. The number of songs was always the same. Sometimes the songs were the same, and that is how I grew up, with this very rigid liturgy that was very similar to the way that it was in the Catholic Mass service. And as far as differences between the Catholic tradition and my faith tradition, they're numerous. Just theologically, they're numerous, but also just in the service, they're, even in my incredibly traditional upbringing, there was still a piano, there was still an organ. Every once in a while, my uncle would bring his guitar, we would sing. And so the instrumentation was a little bit different, since there was some that wasn't vocals. The language was not Latin. We spoke in English. We did have a Spanish service. We also had a deaf ministry, and so there, English wasn't the only language that was being spoken, but it was the primary language. So that's a huge difference between that service and the one I grew up with. But also the same as with Anglican service, the iconography just didn't exist in growing up. And there's a great deal of it in the Catholic Church. You pray to saints, you use a rosary, you have crucifix, you have all kinds of iconography that just doesn't transfer into the Protestant faith. In fact, it's quite honestly very dry artistically, or at least visually artistically in a visual sense. It's just very dry and very empty. And as far as my experience goes, just generally, I was welcomed. I've never been in a room, whether it be a gospel service or where I was the only white guy, or it be this Catholic Mass where I was, again, the only white guy. I've never been in that service with people who love the Lord and then felt like I was any less of a human because of my look different. And while I did feel sort of like the odd man out because I did not speak Spanish or Latin in this Mass service, many people who spoke, fairly broken English, but English nonetheless, would speak to me and be part of, feel like they wanted to welcome me in and welcome me to the service. Their biggest question was, this is a Hispanic service, right? When they found out I didn't speak English, they just thought, oh, this poor man has come to the wrong service, and he feels like he can't leave. So they were very welcoming, they were very kind, and very merciful and gracious. I never felt judged, and when they, it never really came up that I was not Catholic. I think that's just sort of assumed that you're Catholic and you went to the wrong service. But it was really insightful. All of these worship experiences and different faith traditions, they were all insightful in that I got a chance to see behind the curtain at another faith tradition, whether it be similar to mine or completely different than mine. Being able to see that we are people who share these a lot of common beliefs, actually, regardless of where they end up. They have a lot of the same core ideas and core beliefs, whether they be Jewish or go to a gospel church or have, go to a Catholic mass or Orthodox church. They're ordained member of the Orthodox church. Humans are humans, and that never changes and that never goes away. So all in all, I'm grateful for this experience to be able to go to these places, and especially this Catholic Mass. It was really good for my heart to feel that odd man outness as a white man who is, grew up upper middle class or middle class. That doesn't happen to me very often. That's not a feeling that I am very familiar with, and I think that is to my detriment. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to go to a worship service at a Hispanic Catholic Mass.